When thinking about an ethical problem, first of all, you should start always with your gut intuition. What's my intuition about this case? But you never stop there, right? You have to keep pushing yourself to say, why do I think this? First thing to do, I think, is to think about cases that are somewhat similar but somewhat different. Sometimes it's varying one fact. So a great example from this, a classic one in philosophy, is the trolley problem, right? You're the conductor of a trolley, it's coming at a branch in the road. You're heading towards 5 people, but if you flip the switch, you can redirect it so that it kills only one person. What should you do? It's a problem. Well, when we start with that case, we then begin with variations. What if it's 3 people versus 1 person? What if, in fact, there are 3 tracks and not 4, and one of them would lead, 3 tracks and not 2, and one of them would lead to your own death, for example? What if, in fact, instead of having to just flip the switch, you'd have to push a fat man off a bridge to get in the way of the trolley? So these are all variations in the case, and you begin by thinking, does my answer change by that variation? Why would my answer change in that variation? Can I derive a principle from this? So there are principles like action versus inaction, the greater versus the fewer, right? The question of how proximity I am. Did I cause the problem to begin with, or am I just coming on the scene at a time when I can help, for example? So you push yourself to derive principles. You then test those principles out in new cases that are alike and unalike again. So that's one way of approaching the problem. The other is a much more top-down way, which is to start thinking about big schools of thinking in ethics. And really the big schools are, on the one hand, consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is probably the most common, which says that which maximizes good is the right thing to do. So do that which maximizes good, and we aggregate across people. We think of individuals as containers of utility in the classic utilitarianism. Second big school is deontology, of which the most famous version is probably Kantianism. And here there is idea that even if something would maximize good states of affairs, would produce the most welfare, we sometimes have obligations to do something different. We have constraints on what we can do. And for Kant, it was a question of whether the maxim behind your action could result in a universal law of nature. That was his test, or one of his tests, under the categorical imperative. So Kantians think about things like rights, they think about things like dignity, and they think about it in a way that is freestanding from welfare and utility. And the third big division are what are called virtue ethicists, who really have their roots all the way back to Aristotle. And these folks think that instead of thinking about the right or the good, instead we ought to think about character. We ought to think about what it is to be a virtuous person. What are the virtues of being a good human being? Just as we can say a piece of clothing was excellently made, or a horse is an excellent horse, they think that there are characteristics of human beings that make human beings better versus worse. And when we think about what to do, we ask ourselves, what would a virtuous agent do in this situation? So that's another way of approaching the problem, a little bit more abstractly. And in the ideal world, those two approaches kind of meet in the middle. And we think about also other kinds of problems we've encountered in our lives and what's helped us in thinking about that. So in the ancient Greeks, there was a famous philosopher who was known for actually dressing in rags and walking around ancient Athens. He was kind of known as a crank and a fool, and he had like a lantern, and he was struggling always towards the truth. And I think that's really where we are as ethicists. We have to realize that we're struggling through these conversations. We can't avoid making decisions. We're in a position where we have to decide. This is true of courts also. When they're faced with a particularized dispute, they have to decide who gets the kidney. Do we allow abortion to go forward? Are we allowing people to commit assisted suicide, physicians to assist? These are real dilemmas, and somebody has to make a decision. But even though we have to make a decision, it's important to realize we're struggling towards it. We're constantly learning, constantly debating. We can think in abstract terms and think about these principles and policies and philosophies, which is all very good, but it's important to also realize that we're situated. We are trapped to some extent by the possibilities of the world we live in. If you look at the history of reasoning about ethical questions, in particular the example of slavery in America, it's easy from where we stand to say this was a failing of moral imagination, a failing of moral ethics, that these people were just unethical. But in reality, I think the right way to think about it is these were people who were thinking about dilemmas in the world, in a particular world, in a particularized world. That doesn't excuse them. We can still view the practice as wrong, but we have to also realize that 100 years from now, we may be the victims of this historical kind of judgment, right? It could be that our treatment of the animals, for example, the idea that we ate animals is viewed 100 or 500 years from now as barbaric, much the same way we view slavery or genocide or other kinds of horrible acts. So this is to say, we do the best we can. We struggle. We have to be humble about what we can figure out. It's not an excuse for not figuring out. It's not an excuse for bringing our best selves forward, but it's also to realize that in the cold light of historical judgment, even the kinds of decisions we're able to make will seem at times weak and seem at times to the future wrong. So I think it's easy to think that the people who have to worry and think about ethics are people like me who study it professionally or teach it. But in reality, every day in your life, you're probably faced with 2 or 3 ethical dilemmas. And you may become so habituated to what you do in the situation. Everything from do you give money to the person begging on the street, to do you tell a white lie, to those of us who are in professions like medicine or law, professional questions that come up on a day-to-day basis. This is just to say that to be more attuned, to be more in the moment, to live kind of a mindful life, there's a kind of ethical mindfulness that's really good. And there's a well-known study that shows that studying ethics and thinking about ethics doesn't itself make you a more ethical person. There's a famous study done by psychologists where people were given a task of studying up on, they were theology students, I think, and preparing a sermon on the Good Samaritan from the Bible, the person who helps other people. And they engineered it so the person was late for whatever lecture they had to give, was running out, and there was somebody with crutches, if I remember the experiment right, falling on the street. And the question was, were those people who were given the task of preparing and thinking about the Good Samaritan more ethical and more likely to help a person than people who had been given a different task or thinking about a different thing? And the result was actually no. They weren't particularly more ethical. They weren't less, which is good as I recall the study, but they certainly weren't more ethical and didn't help more, which is just to say, studying ethics is great, but living ethics and putting it into your life and being ethically mindful is equally important. It's a question of being aware of the kinds of dilemmas you're facing in a particular day, taking a moment out of your day to think about it, talk about it with others, and think about how you can live a better life and be a more ethical person.